So let's talk about something that is really fascinating, and that is rabbit color genetics. And though you should absolutely not be breeding just for color, you should be considering the colors that you're pairing together and how those genetics play and interact when you're picking your breeding pairs. And for those of you wondering, I am using this crochet hook as a pointer. Don't judge. So all of our rabbit colors are going to be made up of these 5 loci. So you have an A locus, a B locus, a C locus, a D locus, and an E locus. Each of these loci have their own alleles that fall under them, and these help modify the color so that it changes what you see. Now, before we get into this, I just want to clarify, your phenotype is the expression of the genes, that is how it appears, how your eyes see it, versus genotype is the genetic code of what is expressed. So for instance, a blue rabbit, that's its phenotype, but its genetic code may be different between 2 different blue rabbits. And that is because of these genes here. So the first locus that we're going to start off with is the A locus, and this affects the patterning on the hair shaft. So here you can see our dominant here is the agouti gene. Now, agouti is what is responsible for the rings that you see within a coat. So if you were to blow into the coat, you would see all of these different rings of color throughout, going all the way down the hair shaft. That is the agouti pattern. Then we come here to the tan. This is the tan pattern. It's not responsible for creating a tan color on your rabbit. That is a different gene. The tan pattern creates a self-color looking rabbit, but it has accents of a lighter color on things like the underside. So you'll find that in things like your tans, your otters, and your silver martins. Then we come to the most recessive gene on this list, and that is the self gene. This is a solid color rabbit in which that same solid color goes from the base of the hair shaft all the way to the tip. The next locus we're going to look at is the B locus, and this is responsible for your rabbit's color. Every rabbit in the world, regardless of the color that your eyes are perceiving, is either black or the recessive chocolate. Every single rabbit, it's either black or chocolate. And this includes your white rabbits. Your white rabbits are still either going to be black or chocolate, but it's being masked by other genes. Next, we have here the C locus, and this is responsible for the color saturation in the hair shaft itself. So you have your dominant trait here. This is your large C. That is a full color. All of that full color is going to be saturated in the color of the rabbit. Next, you have your chinchilla. This is chinchilla dark. This is the second most recessive on this locus. And this is responsible for a complete erasure of all yellow tones within the color. And next down from that, we have our chinchilla light, which erases some or most of the yellow tone within a color. A really easy way to look at these is in terms of your printer ink. The more dominant of the two, the chinchilla dark, that's going to be like you're completely out of yellow ink, versus your chinchilla light, you have very little yellow ink left and it's just kind of sparsely being used. After that, we have the Himalayan gene. This is what's responsible for creating a white rabbit that has points on the extremities, like the nose and the feet and tail of that color. Now, depending on your breed, this may be considered a Himalayan, or I know in Angoras it's considered a pointed, but it is responsible for this gene. And last but not least is the most recessive of all of these genes, and that is the complete erasure gene. So that is going to be what is most would consider your albino rabbit or your ruby-eyed white. That's a fully white rabbit with red eyes, and that is because all of the color has been completely erased from that rabbit. Now, what's really interesting about this gene is it will require 2 copies, so it must be homozygous, of this gene, but all of these other colors will still exist. So every other genetic code still exists within that color. It's just completely blocked out by that recessive pair. And that's why, even though you have a ruby-eyed white, it's still either black or brown. So next we're going to come to the D locus, and that is going to be the dilution of our B locus. So this is going to create your lilacs or your blues. The dominant trait here is the intense, and that's going to produce the black or chocolate. But if your rabbit has too recessive of the dilute gene, it's going to create either the blue or lilac. Blue being the recessive of the black, and lilac being the recessive of the chocolate. And then finally we get to the E locus, and that's pretty much mainly comprised of your full extension or non-extension genes. This particular locus, much like the agouti, has to do with the way that the color is carried on the rabbit, but with a few different exceptions. So with a full extension, which is the more dominant, you're going to get that color saturation pretty much throughout the rabbit. With the non-extension, that color, that's where you get your torts from. So that's going to produce that shading type on your rabbits. And there are a couple of noteworthy genes that are also kind of tied in with this, and that is your steel and your harlequin. These kind of modify these genes a little bit, so they're not really considered on their own on this locus, but they do interplay in these a little bit of their own way, and I'll be getting into these when I do a separate video on the E locus. The E locus really does require its own separate video to fully understand it. Every rabbit that you see is going to have different allele patterns on these 5 core loci. Now, there are other genes that are going to impact the way that this is expressed, but at the core, it's all going to be these 5. One of the more notable ones here is a very dominant gene, and that is the broken gene. If a rabbit is broken, that means it has the dominant trait of EN, so it has the broken pattern. And that broken pattern you can have in any combination of these genes here, but it's broken up with large patches of white. A rabbit that has the recessive EN, it does not have the broken pattern, and that's most rabbits. Now, noteworthy here is EN in a double dominant. That's going to produce a Charlie, which is less than 10% color. Then we come down here to the silvering gene, and you're going to see this gene in your silver fox, creme d'argents, champagne d'argents, argent bruns. Silvering is a recessive trait, so a homozygous dominant on this allele is going to produce no silvering. If your rabbit is homozygous recessive, it will have different variations of silver. You have an S1, an S2, and an S3. S1 is the least amount of silvering, where S3 is the most amount, and that's typically found in things like your champagne d'argents. Worth noting here is that this is a co-dominance trait, meaning that the dominance is actually split between the two when they're paired together. So instead of this being dominant to this, it actually kind of splits and they do their own thing, creating a separate pattern. And that's a sporadic white hair throughout the coat. Lastly, for this video, I'm not going to get into Vienna next. I'll do that in a different video, but lastly for this video is your wideband. And that is another recessive trait. Wideband is going to produce things like your reds, like those deeper reds. That is expressed with a recessive, a double recessive, and that's because that double recessive creates wider rings in that agouti pattern. It's also going to produce no undercolor. So the underside of the rabbit is not going to have that color saturation. Because it's recessive, any trait that is, or any of these that are paired with the dominant trait is going to produce a normal agouti pattern. This video is already quite long and I'm not going to have time to get into Vienna, so I'll do that in the next video.